Good evening and welcome to the last lecture for business ethics. Tonight, I want to bring everything that we've discussed together, and I believe the best place to begin is with a quote from one of the articles that you were supposed to read this week. Business ethics represents moral principles an organization uses to ensure all employees act in an acceptable manner when completing business functions. Social responsibility is typically an ideological theory governments and the general public hold, believing that business should not conduct themselves in a manner contrary to cultural or societal norms. The blending of business ethics and social responsibility bears when organizations implement a written code of ethics to prove that the organization only acts in its best interest so long as it does not damage the organization's social responsibility. I guess this is fairly typical of what I've heard about business ethics over the course of my lifetime. And I respond with a question specifically because there are terms here that are not only circular, but which ultimately I believe are wanting. So the moral principles an organization uses to ensure all employees act in an acceptable manner when completing business functions. I guess fundamentally, one of the themes that we've seen throughout the semester, particularly when we follow Friedman, is that there is a vast difference between an acceptable manner within a business and the social responsibility of a business until and unless the business itself focuses on a coherent and consistent pattern of behavior which reflects general moral principles. Let's look more closely at that. If you recall, one of Friedman's most essential points is that the only function, the only purpose of a business is to generate a profit. He defines that as the only ethical imperative. Again, this is not new. This is something we've talked about the entire semester. And the problem that we have seen is that when you take capitalism and you combine it with social Darwinism, then you come to the point where we are exactly where we are today. So we've seen, particularly the element of social Darwinism, specifically, in addition to the argument that business has no responsibility to the society as a whole, actually make the social problems that we face worse. And in fact, they appear insolvable. So I'm concerned that when we talk about acceptable practice within the business, that we're ultimately reinforcing the social Darwinism that is at the base of free market capitalism. Again, to be very clear, the problem is not capitalism in and of itself. Because if we go back to Adam Smith, whether it was ultimately tenable or not, his argument was that the excess of capital would ultimately benefit all, not some. We can argue whether or not that contention was fundamentally real, but there is, as some authors have pointed out, a kind of beneficence in Adam Smith, which, as we noted earlier in the semester, is picked up in Darwin with the notion of morality beginning with sympathy, where sympathy is initially focused on the weak, but ultimately, in some sense, on the best interest of all. When we move from capitalism, as outlined by Adam Smith, to free market capitalism and its inculcation of the theory of social Darwinism, there is no room for sympathy. There is no room for the common good. Good evening, Nicole. How are you? I hope you're doing well. Any questions so far? I know you joined a minute or two late. Okay, let's see. We have a chat. All right. So let's get back to where we were. So social Darwinism as an entity apart from free market capitalism and the theory of capitalism as originally articulated by Adam Smith. Again, by way of review, if we begin with Malthus's basic theory, that scarcity is the ultimate conclusion of an increase in population. Then, as we've said, whether he intended it or not, and there are some people who feel he did not intend what happened, it leads to a question of who's going to eat. And that assumes, of course, that food can never match an increase in population indefinitely. So ultimately, as we see in the 19th century, this led to a pattern of social engineering which, courtesy of the work of people like Galton, clearly favored the rich over the poor and resulted in a series of policies under the writing of people like Sumner and Ross that ultimately set the stage for the problems that we've seen in the 20th century and the problems which we inherit today. I think what I find particularly problematic and particularly troubling is the extent to which it is assumed in business that free market capitalism, as defined by Friedman and including the theories of social Darwinism, is the only way the world can be looked at. We've argued over the course of the semester that as long as this paradigm remains in place, our ability to solve the problems we face is increasingly diminished. Again, the problem isn't capitalism in and of itself, nor is it business in and of itself. It's the mixing of business with social Darwinism, and it's the unquestioning adherence to the principles of social Darwinism as they make their way into the general theory of business in the 20th century through Friedman. So let's take a look at where we are before we talk about some potential solutions. One of the points that we made is that if we go back to 1800 and we track the evolution of human society, especially in the United States, we know that the breakdown of the nuclear family began far earlier. And that effectively, that breakdown is inherent in industrialization. We know that over time, and we can see statistically, that it leads inevitably to a two-class society. And you'll remember the material that we read over the course of the semester and the conversations we've had demonstrate very clearly that, especially since 1970, the economic gains that were made in the first part of the 20th century were completely lost. We've argued that the theory of race suicide that Ross advanced in 1910, which said that left unchecked, people of color and inferior humans will out-reproduce Northern European whites, has given way to what I would call class suicide. And class suicide is a variation of race suicide and says essentially that if we in general don't stop poor people and people who we feel are defective or not superior from reproducing, in the long term, they will out-reproduce the rich and the powerful. From welfare to a lack of universal health care, to underfunded schools, we're seeing an increased pressure to break down our culture into a two-class system. And while we haven't specifically read about it, we've talked a number of times about the reality of the fact that technology is driving further a general move towards rampant unemployment. So in the name of generating more profit, the only thing left is to cut the human worker. Kiosks, self-serve, the linking of a better user experience to self-service, self-checkout, Walmart buying 15,000 robots to clean the floors. It's ultimately not tenable. And one of the points that we keep coming back to is that no one is looking down the road. No one is looking at the consequences. And since we have a consumer-based economy, the question is, who will be able to consume? What does the future ultimately look like? Okay, any questions? Ashari, Nicole, Rubith, any questions? Am I making sense?
No, sorry, I just joined.
Hi, everybody. Okay, so we're making sense. That's good. All right. Let's get back to work. So, are there any points that we would like to clarify about this or anything else that we've covered so far this semester before I make a few more comments and we start to consolidate and bring this to a close? Anything that we can better explain, anything that we can look at more deeply? For those of you who joined us late, I'm going to change my screen sharing. We began class by looking specifically at this passage and the point that I made is that if you read that, aside from the fact that the logic is somewhat circular, it ultimately comes to no conclusion. The blending of business ethics and social responsibility bears when organizations implement a written code of ethics to prove that the organization only acts in its best interest so long as it does not damage the organization's social responsibility. And essentially, the point that they're making there is that businesses should have some kind of a balancing act between what's best for the business and what's best for society. But the problem I find in that article, the problem I find with business ethics in general, is it never comes to a conclusion as to what's best for society. All right, questions? Whitley, Nicole, Rubith, Ashari, anybody?
No, I just got into the meeting. Sorry.
That's okay. That's okay. Let me put it to you this way. I think that the priority needs to shift. I think we know fairly clearly what's best for our society. Rampant unemployment is not. The absence of health care is not. The crisis in education that we've been talking about since 1970 is not. The further concentration of wealth in the hands of fewer and fewer people is not. So I guess the point that I would make is I'm not sure why there are so many questions surrounding what's best for society. So if you think about it, over the course of the semester, one of the points that we came back to repeatedly was the question of a common good. And the point that we keep making is that we as a society have lost any sense of common good. That is largely attributable to the work of John Stuart Mill, and to the collapse in Western society that took place, you'll recall, in the 17th century. Does that make sense? I'm going to assume it is, since we've talked about it many times. And you'll remember that Mill said there are to be two guiding principles: harm and redress. The principle of harm is what has generated the radical autonomy of the individual in our society. And the principle of redress basically has been a failure. So what we've inherited has left us narcissistic, selfish, egotistical, and ultimately morally bankrupt. That's where we are. And it's further being fueled, you'll recall from one of our discussions, by a consumer-based economy. Just do it. Don't think about the impact. Don't think about whether you should or shouldn't. Just do it. So not only does business not invest in the common good, it promotes actions which further destroy the common good and leave us empty. Questions, thoughts? Okay. Let's talk about another way to look at this. Along the way, we talked about other paradigms in Western culture. One of which was existentialism. You may recall that we said when we apply existentialism to the question of human ethics, the question becomes, what is the human and humane thing to do? If we think about what happened with Edward Herbert, he rejected an a priori understanding of what it means to be human, which also resulted in the rejection of an a priori understanding of ethics. You cannot have ethics without some kind of foundation. So what we've attempted to argue is that the one thing that we all have in common is that we all die. And that effectively we live in a world where the only certainty is death. When we talked about Martin Heidegger, whose philosophy is the basis for this, we said that it comes down to a fundamental choice. On the one hand, despair and denial. On the other, Zorg, where Zorg, which cannot be translated directly into English, means love, compassion, kindness, care, concern. we can build a society that's based on the deepest kind of love of all, which is acknowledging the fact that in a world in which all that is human dies, loving, caring, being compassionate, being patient, being gentle is the only way forward. If we ask ourselves, what is the human and humane thing to do? It seems to me fairly obvious that you will not objectify someone. You will not disrespect anyone. You will treat everyone with respect and kindness and patience. That it will never be a debate about corporate profits versus the common good, because healthcare is in the interest of all of us. Education is in the interest of all of us. Effective infrastructure is fair, in the best interest of all of us. It is the human and humane thing to do. Any questions so far? Okay. Camus, throughout his work, refers to the logic of the absurd. The absurd, he said, is born in the confrontation between our demand for meaning and the silence of the universe. And the operative word here is silence. We can demand all the meaning we want, but that does not mean that the universe will respond. And Camus says, following Heidegger, that in an absurd world, only the absurd makes sense. And in a world in which all that is human dies, the most absurd thing we can do is to love. I told you at some point back at the early part of the semester that in the end, there really is only one question. I called it the human question. The human question is, what does it mean to be human? And the answer is to love in a world in which all that is human dies. I regret in part that this class has only been online because I haven't really been able to engage you the way that I would if you were sitting in the same room. It's been a much more clinical exchange of information. So in the interest of taking away the clinical, I was sent to work when I was 7. And shortly after I went to work as a migrant on a farm in Connecticut, one of the children died. And that night we were asked in Spanish and in English, "What did you learn today?" And the answer was that this is what happened to children like us. We would die on the farm. I never expected to see the age of 18. But throughout my life, a woman who saved me from bleeding to death when I cut an artery open in my hand on the farm by accident, a guy at Yale University's Peabody Museum who invited me to go to work there when I was 10 and a half, teachers, people who had no reason cared. 3 years ago next month, I got an email from a student over the weekend asking that I meet him for coffee. So I met him on a Monday morning at Coffeeology. He looked up at me and he said, "I'm glad you're here, but I don't remember ever having emailed you." At which point he flipped out of the chair, had a drug overdose because of a drug overdose, and nearly died. And if I hadn't been there, he probably would have died in his apartment alone. The world is changed for better or for worse, one life at a time. And every revolution in the history of the world, for better or worse, began with one human who saw the world not as it was, but as it could be. See the world again for the first time. If we proceed from the logic of love, then only our humanity matters. Not making a profit, not feeling that we're better than someone or that we need to oppress someone to feel better about ourselves. And in the end, business becomes a human and humane activity. Any questions? Any thoughts? Anything I can clarify before I tell you what will happen between now and when I turn grades in? Okay, I'm going to put up a practice quiz tomorrow. The day after reading day, the exam will go live. It'll have 2 parts. It'll be open for 4 days. I have a question. Let me see what that is. Okay. I really appreciate the effort that you all have shown. I know this is not easy, especially 8 o'clock on a Monday night. And thank you. I have learned a lot through my interactions with you. So I will leave you with one thought before I stop sharing my screen and take attendance. If you ever need me, I will always be your teacher. Don't hesitate to reach out. On that note, I'm going to stop recording and stop sharing.